Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning if you're on the other side of the world. Thanks for joining today's webinar, where I have a very special guest along with me, which we shall go and find shortly. So welcome to you if you're watching on YouTube and Facebook, and thirdly, also if you're in our webinar room as well. For those of you in our webinar room, just a couple of questions, couple of points, because there is rather a lot of you. If you want to ask a question, then make sure you do so in the Q&A tab. I've also got Diego with me hanging out in there as well, and also on YouTube and Facebook. So if you have a question, put it in there. It just keeps it separate from the chat, but do feel free to chat amongst yourselves as well. But if you want to hide that panel in the webinar room, you can just click that little downward arrow and that will give you a bit more space on screen as well to see Capture One in action. And do keep your questions coming as well. That's the whole point of these sessions, and I'll do my best, or we will do our best to answer as many those as possible. So let's go and find Rachel. Hey Rachel.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Before we get started, because we're going to dive straight into Capture One on your machine, if you can tell us a bit about yourself and where you're from and what you do.
Yeah, so I'm a food photographer. I am an Australian, but I currently live in Vancouver, Canada. I know some of my audience are here today and they already know that I'm actually celebrating 10 years of being a food photographer this
Congratulations.
month. It's crazy, thank you. So I mostly prefer to do like editorial food photography, also like some beverage work within that. So in terms of food photography, it's one of those niches that is like, we see food photos all the time, but we sort of get left out a little bit.
Yes.
But in case you're interested, I usually shoot for clients anywhere from like social media to, magazine to online web content, all those sorts of things. So yeah, it's really exciting. And I also make a lot of the food myself. Sometimes I'll have a stylist or an assistant with me, but definitely over the last couple of years, I've had to really, beef up my cooking skills.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well,
Yeah.
with that in mind, let's go over and switch ourselves to Capture One. So the plan was for today, I had some carefully written notes, which I've now hidden. So we were going to focus today pretty much on talking about color editing and color harmonies in food photography and so on. So you've got a few pictures which we're hiding, so I'm just going to hide ourselves for a second. So we've got a few different pictures to work through and to cover some different techniques in Capture One.
Yeah, so I will just mention too, I have customized my own workspace in Capture One. So if it looks a little bit different, that's sort of what I've done there. But to jump into like food photography, I just wanted to think or like explain a little bit about color when it comes to food. So when you think about like when we go to buy food, like color is really important to us. Like it tells us a lot about the food. It tells us, if it's ripe. So if you go to buy like a banana and you buy it and it's green, like we know that it's not quite ready for eating. So all of those things are like subconsciously there, and I think they translate into our work. And I think that's something important to think about when we're trying to tackle color. Not to say that we can't, be creative when it comes to food, because we definitely can. But when it comes to color, thinking about, this is what the webinar is like, what is the correct color versus like what looks appetizing as well. So I think those questions, I don't tend to like follow rules, but I think those questions are something that I always think about. And then I think, what's the best thing for my subject and for my sort of food story.
And I guess we taste with color to some extent as well, like looking at I don't know, a purple, something that shouldn't be purple, turns us off, doesn't it? So we get that impression.
Exactly. Or one of the things I often think about is like when we cut open an avocado and it is that beautiful, like juicy green. There's like that perfect spot that when you open it, you're like, this is going to be fantastic. Sometimes you can open it, unfortunately, it's like brown or yellow. So we definitely are able to like taste with those colors as well. So I think that's something we definitely want to like translate with the tools that we have available to us in Capture One.
Great.
So jumping into our first example,
Yep, let's do it.
I wanted to pull up a chocolate cake because I often hear from people that they struggle with orange foods, but also like brown foods. So if we look at something like the basic editor that we have over here, like you will obviously know that we don't have like a brown panel to necessarily tackle, but chocolate is something we use to describe as a color quite often in terms of fashion. We even have like, you have a chocolate Labrador as a type of dog. So it's something that we use all the time to describe color. And I wanted to use this example to show that when it comes to food especially, there's rarely like a pure color. We're always going to find a mix of colors within a subject. Even if you think about like heirloom tomatoes, you will have like red and orange and yellow and green often in the one subject. So really thinking about the colors that you have within the food and like how they're mixing together will often help us tackle food photography. So I'm going to just, the examples I wanted to show you today, I wanted to sort of talk about the tools that I would use to approach these individual photos as well. So one of the things that I adore about Capture One is the advanced color editor. It really helps me to focus and target specific colors, which we will look at throughout this webinar as well. But the basic color editor can often do a lot of things as well. So that's usually like the place that I like to start. So with the color editor, thinking about like our chocolate cake, what I want to do for you is I'm just going to create a clone variant just so that I have like the edit and we can just play around with this one.
So is this one, does this one have any adjustments on it at the moment, or is it straight out of camera?
It's the same.
Right.
No, so this would be, so if I was to like reset it, that's what it would look like.
Okay.
So let's just jump back in. Okay. So what I wanted to do, is that actually picking it? Sorry. I might have to recreate that. For some reason, it's not letting.
Oh, you're just on a heel layer. There we go.
Oh, it just jumped onto a different layer.
Yeah.
That's always fun. All right. So thinking about color, I wanted to jump into the different like color swatches that we had, and just have a look at what happens when I desaturate the red, and just have a look at like the chocolate cake itself. So when it comes to something like chocolate, we are really looking at like red, orange, yellow, and even sometimes you will find there's a little bit of green in there because there's a little bit of yellow. So let's do the orange as well. So we can really see that we have predominantly probably orange, but we also have some reds in there. And then there is going to be like a tiny amount of yellow. I hope you can see that on the screen, just the smallest amount as well. So when it comes to like editing something like chocolate, I always think about jumping into the color editor and having a look at my reds, my oranges, and my yellows. And then thinking about like, do I want the chocolate cake to feel rich? And if I want it to feel rich, I'll probably play, let's just jump into the oranges, and I might want to saturate that particular color. And then, within each color swatch, we have our sort of spectrum from reds to yellows. And this is where even like the green can come in. So for me, I think about rich chocolate is going to focus on the oranges, but I don't want it to be like too red. So then I might jump into the red, and you can see I've done a little bit of an adjustment here. Is instead of taking them further into the red, I might bring that into the orange as well and just saturate that a little bit. And one of the things that's going to happen when we work with color is we will make an adjustment, and then because we have, we have reds, orange, and yellow within this subject, we might start to think that maybe it's looking a little bit too orange now, or maybe a little bit too red. So we always want to come back to these individual tools and just make little fine adjustments until the color starts to look, appetizing to us. In the yellow slider here, I have brought that more into the orange section than the green. I know that we've got a little bit of stuff that's happening on the mandarin slices as well, but if we just focus on the chocolate cake, I will sort of think about, do I want to remove a little bit of that green, and do I want to shift that into the yellow a little bit more just to tweak those sorts of colors. So turn this on and off. Maybe I'll just try to like zoom in. Hopefully we can see, you know, that little bit of color change that's happening there.
Yep, we can, definitely. We got a question
So
from,
that when,
sorry,
okay.
it's a preemptive
Yeah,
question, which we're going to cover. So, well, first of all, Howard says, why do I feel hungry right now? Which is exactly what you want to happen,
Ooh,
isn't
yay.
it?
Yes.
And Fi was saying, why not use the advanced tool? But you're actually going to compare the advanced tool as we move through, aren't you?
Yeah, we're definitely going to use the events tool. And I think one of the things that like I do when it comes to editing is I don't necessarily follow rules. I always think about like what colors do I want to tackle and how do I want to change them? And then I think about the best tool for the job. So a lot of the times, you know, the advanced tool, we can really focus on isolating colors. It does take just a little bit more work. So for something like this chocolate cake, I know that it just needs a little bit of adjustment with those sliders and that I can do that really quickly. So that's something that I would do. If I found at that point that I was like, you know, it's starting to mess with the mandarin oranges and how they're looking, then we would start to approach it differently. We would jump into the advanced tool. We'd make sure that we selected things differently. So that's a really great point. And it's something that's always sort of, you know, in my mind. So I sort of start there. If that doesn't work, I'll move to the next tool. And sometimes I know that like the advanced tool is just going to be the perfect tool for the job. So
Exactly. Right tool for the job.
yeah, exactly. Okay, so that's a little bit sort of about like how I would tackle something like a chocolate or like a brown, and I think it's very surprising sometimes to see that we have those colors in there. So one thing I would suggest to people as well, if they're unsure, if you do come into the basic color editor, you know, and you start to play around with the saturation, then you can start to see like certain colors and what they're doing as well. If you're unfamiliar with this tool, we do have this little picker down the bottom, so it's going to help you show which colors. So if I click on the chocolate here, it's going to help you see which sort of colors that we have, or like the predominant color. So that's another way that you can sort of use that tool if you aren't familiar with that little cursor tool that we have there. Do we have any other questions before I like segue into the rhubarb potentially?
There was a question from Elena. Where is it? Oh, she was asking, do you do all of your editing work in Capture One? I'm guessing you're probably doing a bit in Photoshop too.
Yeah, so I will use Photoshop to do my retouching. So, you know, I do have a heel. So if we just jump onto, there is a heel layer here. If we take a look. Okay, so there's like a few little spots that I've removed. So really easy, really quick to do that in Capture One. So if there's a few little spots or blemishes, like I can do that really easily. If I'm going to be, you know, I prefer to dodge and burn in Photoshop. If I'm going to do like composites or complex removals, I will take them from Capture One into Photoshop, do that and bring them back.
And Tracy was asking, is there a before and after view? Which, yes, there is. So you can just click that on so Tracy can see.
Look.
Yep, there we go, before and after. So simple. And you can shortcut that. You can have a slider like Rachel's showing as well. So, yeah, simple.
Yeah, so with the before and after tool, I prefer to have it in the full view. I also have like a keyboard shortcut, which I just like quickly press, so I can just, sometimes it is really nice to take a look at the raw file and what you've done as you come along. For food photography, because a lot of it is still live, it's in studio, a lot of the time food photographers will tether. So we don't, when I'm tethering, I'll do like a little bit of editing as I go. So most of the time when I'm jumping into the final edits, I already have like a base edit and I've sort of looked at that process as I go. So it's a tool that I don't use probably as much as if I was shooting, you know, straight in camera. So
got it.
Just a little fun tip. Okay. So coming into like a combination of sort of like the basic and advanced. So I wanted to carry on that idea of thinking about like what colors are we subconsciously looking for in food, and what tells us when something is cooked or when it's ripe and when it's going to be juicy to eat. You know, when we're dealing with something like chocolate, those colors, so our reds, our oranges, our yellows, are all sort of hidden within that subject. With this photo, we still have those colors. So we've got a bit more of like a pinky red and orange, and we have those yellows, like it could be a touch of like a yellowy green as well. But here we actually see that we have them throughout the subject. So this is one of those things a lot of is a variety that is really quite pink. So thinking about like when you cut those stalks up and you're stewing them, you will sometimes find a variation of color, which I find is very interesting in a photo, having different colors, and they're analogous colors, so they're next to each other on the color wheel. Bring some of that color theory in, and I think it just brings interest to the shot as well. So if I turn off the color adjustments that we've done here, so we're probably looking at, you know, we have a little bit more of like a green yellow. So just think about like subconsciously, like what is your brain telling you? It's probably saying, you know, this doesn't look as appetizing as this, probably because we know like when we see some of these vegetables or fruits that are green, they're not quite ripe. So we want to be thinking about like how we can shift those colors. So let me just check. Okay. What I might do is bring out the tool, so we can just focus on that. So this is a combination, this is a photo I should say, is where I would use a combination of the basic and the advanced tool. So what I would do first is jump into the red. So let's just reset this here. So I'll be thinking about, I really specifically wanted to make the reds feel a little bit more pinky. So what you could do is you could jump around and have a look and see what colors that we have. So we have some orange here. I know that we have probably some yellows down here, and it's probably unlikely to select the pink. So what I would do first is, I know that I can really quickly jump into the basic editor and just play with some of those colors, and then I'll move to the advanced. So let's just have a look now. So we'll just bring that a little bit of shift into the sort of pinky area of the red, and I am going to bring up the saturation. And again, when it comes to color, like I'm going to be jumping between these tools, because maybe like I've gone too far in the orange and I need to make a little bit of an adjustment in the red. So playing around with those, just bringing things. I'll probably bring these two into sort of the pinks a little bit more. So you can start to see that we've done red and we've done orange, and so because we've moved them into the sort of pinker end of those particular color ranges, we're starting to bring out those pinks first. And then with the yellows, I really want to make sure that we don't have those sort of looking green. So I'm going to bring them into the more orangey end and saturate those. One thing I think is important too is I would still jump into the green here, and I would either just desaturate it to like remove any greens from the image, because I don't think it needs it. That can also help with color correction. Otherwise, what I could do is think about shifting any sort of lingering greens that might be left over into the sort of yellow end of that green, just to help us with the yellow feeling. So that's more rich, it's more warm, rather than feeling a little bit green.
Question from me. So when you're talking about the yellows and greens, etc., I guess you're almost clustering those colors a little bit. So pushing the, as you said, you didn't like, if you like, the look of the yellow, but if there's any yellow tones in there, then you cluster them towards the green to some extent, I guess.
Yeah, so you can like shift them, and again, we're thinking about like these colors are going to work together, and because they're next to each other on the color wheel as well, we'll need to make sure that we tweak them, and sort of we're tweaking them in essentially like together towards like the, if I open just so we can look at the color wheel here, we're sort of pushing these colors into the red section, or like the pinky section here, just so we have those warm tones. We know that that's what rhubarb's supposed to look like. It's going to feel more inviting. It's going to feel juicy and ripe. So like those are the things that I'm sort of telling myself as I'm shifting the colors to help me match what the vision is. Because again, with food photography, we really want people to be like tasting that in their mouth.
I want
like,
to eat it.
What's the experience going to be like? Yeah.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So just pinks, we're probably not doing a lot, as you can see that's happening here. So this is an example where I would jump into the advanced tools. So I'd be saying to myself, you know, I've done sort of some quick edits. I've done what I can in the basic editor. So now I'm thinking about like, is the pink that's happening here and the red, is it enough? Do I want to jump in and use the advanced tool? So this is probably when I would do that, and I would sort of look at the photo and say, you know, this is the color that I want to shift. So the way the advanced tool works is we're going to take that color and I'm going to shift it a little bit. So I probably want it to be, maybe if we take a look here, I'm going to just make a few selections. You can just see the colors that are coming up. So it's probably a little bit more red than I would like it to be. So this is an occasion where I would, if we just pop on the view selected color range, what I do like about this photo is that we do have still a little bit of orange. So I probably want to I'm going to use these tools here to really focus in on the color range I want to select, which is the red. So I'm going to take a little bit of the orange out, because if we select too much, we're going to start selecting all of those colors. So we really just want to focus on the reds. Okay, we can just play around with this is going to target the saturation of that particular color range that we're looking at as well. So this, I think, helps us really visualize, this is the color we've selected and this is the color we're going to change. So I'm going to go ahead, now that I like that selection, and just play around with bringing it a little bit more into the pink area. Okay, and then you can play with saturation, lightness as well. What I sort of like to do before I have finished editing that is I will come back to look at all the colors. So that probably is maybe a little bit, just a little too saturated. I might just bring that down a touch so we can see, I mean, hopefully you can see that on the screen. It's not a huge adjustment, but it's not the slightest either. So
yeah, no, I can see it on my screen for sure. And I guess it's all about keeping corrections natural as well. Like you're not going to make wide sweeping changes potentially, but it's those little refinements that make such a big difference.
So I will just, because I'm not sure if we have anyone that's like uses Lightroom but is curious about Capture One. One thing that you'll find about Capture One is that I hear from people that they're like, oh, it's really sensitive, which is incredible, because we can make very small points, like on our sliders, we can do like, you know, this saturation is like 1.4 points and it makes a huge difference. So it's, the more sensitive the tool is, you know, we don't need to push it as far, which allows us to have really fine control over that color. So sometimes just the little adjustments in the basic editor, jumping into the advanced, just tweaking that color a little bit can end up with something that, let's just take a look at before and after. You know, we're really making sure that color pops. And I know like contrast and exposure is also going to affect color, but here, after we've done those adjustments, we can just make sure that we're really focused on targeting those colors that we want to do. Do you have any questions about this, the advanced tool, or?
I just saw a couple of comments like, that's so precise, that's really good. And I think that's a good point about the advanced color editor. It can be precise, but you can also not be precise if you like if you wanted to capture all the reds, orange and yellows, you could in a much, you know, wider range as well, which can also be useful.
I mean, we could try that quickly if we turn this off and, you know, I just select a color. a color here. So let's look at our selected color range. We can see that we can, maybe we won't go into the greens as far, but like we can select quite a bit of what's happening in our image here. And just say like maybe you had some, greens in there, which you found the basic editor was, changing too much.
Yep.
This is an example where you could just be like, these warmer colors, I just actually want to saturate them. Like that's a lot, but this is a way that we can like select those particular color range and then go and, target them as well. You could totally do that with, your purples through to your blues here, or, the greens through to cyans as well. So it's very powerful. And I think hopefully we see that we have multiple colors. There's like different ways that we can like approach it within the same tool.
Yeah. And as you said, the basic color editor most of the time gets there. But, in these specific circumstances where you need to, have laser focus or like your own choice, if you like, because the basic color editor, those ranges were chosen for very specific reasons, which I won't bore you with. But sometimes that doesn't necessarily fit the photo. And certainly with food photography, where you have such broad color ranges, the advanced color editor is invaluable. Question that was from Richard, I think, which was a good question. Have you ever found any foods and their colours which are very difficult to photograph? What's the nightmare food?
I think orange is really tough.
Yeah.
It's always a tough colour because it's sort of an all or nothing color. It just feels like it's always very saturated.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to that color, I find you're having to play with like vibrance and saturation, and then the slider shifts into like a yellow or green can just make it look really wrong. So I often feel like we have a narrow window with orange foods.
Right.
So I find those really probably the most challenging. So.
Yeah. I know in our nightmare scenario that we used to shoot for like Phase 1 and other companies I worked for, salmon was always like the hated the hated food because tough. It was hard to reproduce without it looking unappetizing. Yeah. So
yes, I'd say that is a hard color. I think greens are very easy, and I think reds can be very easy. So like baked goods also fall into that orange category, and so we're thinking about like sometimes those yellows and greens, and it can just be a very overpowering color but not a very sexy color in a way as well. So it can be hard to photograph that. In terms of food too, like we do have things to lean on, like of course lighting, and how we tell a story and how we prop a scene. So some of those things I think can help, we can bring in still life to help us balance out some of those colors as well.
Yeah. Michael was asking, do you ever do an overall saturation pull, or do you keep it specific to each color?
Yes, I love that you said that. So we will look at that. I'm going to talk about an example when it comes to that. So just because we're on that, what I will sort of, let's just pop the toolbar back on.
Yeah.
So we're going to jump into this example.
Okay.
As well. But what I tend to often do in my workflow is I will use specific tools like curve tools, clarity tools that don't change color, because I like to have control over saturation. So sometimes what I will do is I'll also like sort of desaturate the photo a little bit so I can go into the colors and really focus on targeting them exactly the way I want. That's how I like to work. That's my preference. However, some jobs, some clients, I actually don't need to necessarily do that. Often, sometimes with lighting, we can get colors really looking great straight out of camera. So with Capture One's saturation slider, it's more like a smart saturation. So it's sort of like what we think about as like a vibrant slider, is it's going to target colors that need to be saturated more than others. So there are definitely times where I can just come in and boost that a little bit, and I'm sort of done. So I love to edit. I really love to dive in to get those colors. I find it, even though it's nerdy, I find it a little bit therapeutic. I love playing with those sorts of things. So I'll tend to sort of go that direction because I enjoy it. But there are definitely times where I have a job right now. I have to do 100 images for a cookbook, and we need to get it done. So if I can jump in and use the saturation slider and it's really good, I will definitely take that option. So
great.
I do love the saturation slider in Capture One too. So that's a really good question.
Yeah, and if any Lightroomers watching, and I know there's a few, so thanks for listening in. The saturation slider, I would say, is closer to what you're used to in Lightroom as vibrancy. So,
the vibrance, yes,
yeah.
exactly.
So even though we call it saturation, it's closer to vibrancy. If you want pure saturation, you can do that in the basic color editor. But vibrancy will just stop already saturated colors going bananas, for want of a better expression, as opposed to pure saturation.
All right, so I'm going to jump into, just make this just a touch smaller. So I wanted to focus on an occasion where I would lean very heavily on the advanced tool. So this was more of like a personal project, and I won't necessarily bore you with all the corny details, but I decided I wanted to like tackle a sort of purpley foods, which is not something that we often see. Like David had mentioned, it's not a color you often see. So I wanted to make it was a blueberry lilac cheesecake. And if you've ever seen lilac flowers, they are this really specific, beautiful purple color. So one, to replicate that color in food and then have it photograph the exact way you want to was a bit of a challenge. So I would really focus on editing this particular color with the advanced color editor. So let's just see if we can. So I haven't done any. Okay, here I've just done some color correction with removing some of those colors. So I haven't done a lot of purple that's happening here. So I think this might be interesting if we can take a look at the cheesecake here. So we have the color of the flour, and then what I did is I had sprinkled some superfood powder over the top, which is what helped me get the color of the cheesecake in the first place. So there's a couple of colors that are happening on the cheesecake, which is great, which is beautiful. But we can also like target all those colors to get them to sort of like work together. So this is where I would lean heavily on the advanced tool to do that. So we just turn these on so we can have a look at just some of those adjustments that we can do there.
Yeah, that suddenly makes it jump off the screen a lot more.
It just jumps off the screen, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So I thought there's something I wanted to mention. So let's I just have found this tool really handy, and some people might not know about it. So if we just jump in, it's going to do the selected color range, so we could just really see that we're selecting our purples here. So if we dive in, you can see that this color that it's selected, which has done a really beautiful job of, we're not actually selecting the lilac flower color, which is great because I might want to leave that and I might want to match the cheesecake to look like that. So one thing I just wanted to share, a tip, is that if you come up to this little section here, when you have your color selected, I can go ahead and make a layer from that color selection. And this is really important when it comes to color. So if I go ahead and do that, what it's going to do is going to take that color that we just selected and pop it on it to its own layer. So you can see it's popped it over here, and you can name it and call it whatever you want. So if I take a look, and I'm going to press the M key so we can see the mask, you can suddenly see that we've selected this color across the entire frame. Now you might be thinking, like, why would we do that? Because the advanced color tool, like, we're just focusing on that color anyway. But just say you wanted to do like a contrast adjustment or a clarity adjustment to that specific color, because, you know, color, exposure, and contrast are all very interlinked and they all work on colors together. It just really allows you to go further with some of those adjustments within a specific color if you like. And we can just, if I zoom in, you can see that.
You can really see how well isolated or
Yeah,
how tight that selection was as
it
well.
is very tight. And, like we have a little bit of selection on the actual flower, but, like look at this crisp edge. Like touch of a button, crisp edge. We just love that. So that's just a little hack that, with something like this, if I want to go further with the color, I would do that as well. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at just focusing on this color. And if I want to make it a little bit more towards a lilac color, I might make the color a little bit cooler. The saturation could be bumped up a little bit. And so lightness is something we haven't touched on a lot yet. And when it comes to using lightness in our color editor tools, I find that just a little bit can really help us bring out the feeling of that color. So it's in a way making the color brighter. So that's a really good thing to play around with as well, because if we'll see the cheesecake, within the shadowed areas, the color is going to be darker. It's going to be a little bit richer. So sometimes we can make it pop off the page by bringing out a little bit of that as well. So we just take a look at just changing that color there. And because I do like the saturation, we can see that I've added a little bit of saturation. So I do really like the way that the saturation slider in the exposure does work. So for Michael's point again, I would sort of play around with that a little bit sometimes just to bring a few of those colors out a little bit separately. Play with it here, also play with it here, just to see what is looking the best for each photo. We can also do things like, it's feeling a little bit pink in this area. If I was really being specific and I wanted to, have a color story where everything matched, I can come in and change that color as well. So I should have mentioned if this is a new tool to you down the bottom, what we can look at as well is when you change that, it's going to show you what the color looks like. So let's go ahead and move it into, sorry, I meant to do the hue slider. Are you seeing the change down in this color box on your screen at all?
Actually, if you turn off... Oh, I think what you found, actually, Rachel, is a bug.
That's happened to me once or twice.
Yeah,
and usually I've restarted it and it's been fine.
It's an intermittent bug with M1 chips, so with Apple Silicon, which is why the blue is also missing. So you can see it says red-green, and then there's a gap underneath. That should be where the blue is. But you'll be glad to know it's fixed and it's coming out soon. But yeah, normally those two boxes would show you the before and the after. Yeah.
Yes. All right. So like this obviously will be fixed.
Yeah.
So what we would have here is we would have the color that we've selected and then the color that we've shifted it to. And I think, when it comes to photography, we have all these beautiful things in the photo, we can get distracted by coming back to these two boxes here where this is fixed, which it will be. It really helps you focus on is this the color that you want, or do you need to shift it a little bit? I think really can help too.
Definitely.
Right, let's take a look. So jumping in and out, we've really changed that color completely. We've tried to match the color of the cheesecake to the lilac flowers that we have here, and on the plate as well we also have that superfood powder and some of the syrup that I was talking about. And because we're using that color range, we're changing all of those colors together, and this is where it starts to look it's a very seamless and very natural change. So we can get really creative when it comes to food as well. So I did this as a personal project for this reason. I wanted to shoot something that was purple and different, and this tool just really allowed me to bring that vision to life and allowed me to play with it. And make sure that I was matching all of those colors together.
And also what strikes me about this picture is that doesn't look edited. Do you know what I mean? You don't look at that and think, oh, someone's gone crazy with the color edits. It just looks, it's popping off the screen. There's nice separation with the background, but I want to eat it, but it doesn't look over edited.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good point because that really comes down to having that fine control. So having these sliders that sometimes people say they're a little bit sensitive really allows us to just do those really small adjustments in combination with each other that make things look really natural.
Cool. I've got a bunch of questions, so I should answer some
Yeah.
before the angry mob descends. Easy one, first of all. Suzanne was asking, what's the backdrop in the purple cheesecake? Where's that from?
This is from a company called Woodville Backdrops. So they make some really excellent sort of wood, double-sided, lots of texture.
Nice.
So that is a really good point for food photography. Having textured backgrounds really helps with our food photos.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's go back up to Philip. It says, do you use a color checker or other color patch panels to establish your color range or white balance?
Sometimes I do, especially for specific clients when we're doing packaging, branding, I will do that because you do want to make sure that you get those colors right. With it something like a little bit more editorial, I usually try to just really focus on what the colors should look like, but that's definitely an option to use those. So it's a little bit of both.
Nice. Alan, are most of your images shot using natural light? If not, is natural light your preference?
All of these photos that we're looking at were shot with artificial light.
Okay.
Unfortunately, in the last few places I've lived, I haven't had the best natural light. So I've had to really was sort of thrust into artificial light. But I love artificial light because I can control it.
Yeah.
So I actually think both types of lighting are totally beautiful. It's more up to like how you use it.
And I guess in the winter in Canada, you've got a small window of opportunity where the light
as
is...
an Australian, we don't have, it doesn't get dark at 3 o'clock like it does here in the Pacific Northwest. So that was like a bit of a shock for me. So in winter, there is not a lot of light to play with for sure. But that's also pretty too. Like you can, it's something different to play with.
Yeah, and I guess in the winter, the sun is super low as well. So that's a different kind of quality of light again, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah. Yvonne was asking, do you always start first in the color editor, like basic and advanced, or do you first adjust exposure, contrast levels and so on?
That is a great point. Yes. So like because we're focusing on color today, you haven't seen me do all the other adjustments, but I focus on color last. So I make sure, usually because I'm tethering, I'll make sure my exposure is, as best I can in camera, but I will do my exposure contrast adjustments first.
Yeah.
I focus primarily on using tools that don't necessarily affect my colors as much because I like to have control over the colors. So color is something I will do last in the process. Color grading, we're not going to get into that today, but just to talk about color grading, that is what I would do when I'm completely happy with the photo as well. So I tried to do color at the end. Having said that, everything we do affects the image because usually we're doing a lot of global adjustments. So sometimes I will make a color adjustment and then I think, oh, the contrast is a little bit too much, or I'll go back. So that's sort of how I work, but it's sort of never done. Sometimes you just need to think about those things and do I need to come back to it?
Yeah, and that leads to a good question from Tracy. Along those lines of doesn't look edited, when do you know enough editing is enough? That's the eternal question, isn't it?
It is. That is funny because, with this, I've edited this photo many times. Just for some context, I brought these photos into this session just for today. But if I was to go into like the individual session I've done for the cheesecake, I've got about 10 virtual copies.
Right.
And I think it's because, I was playing with this that sometimes I'm like, oh, is that too overdone? So what I tend to do is I will do, the clone variants, I should say.
Yeah.
I will do my variants and sometimes I'll compare them and I'll think about like, does this one look like it's been edited too much and how's the color feeling with that? So that is a good option if you're not quite sure. Sometimes you can, just to show people again, we can go down and do the clone variant. So when we do the clone variant, it's going to bring all those adjustments over and then maybe I could tweak the color a little bit. So I could potentially turn off one of these. I could go ahead and compare those. So I'm assuming we'll be able to see Can we see full
screen?
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So let me move this around. So this might be an occasion where I would think, does this purple look just a little bit too fake? And if I backed off one of those colors, like, does this look more realistic, or does it need to be somewhere in between? So I think you can compare them that way, and using like the clone variant, I can just make that adjustment very quickly and look at what that, how that feels.
Yeah.
Sometimes the other thing is, like, if you do have the luxury of time, come back to it the next day with fresh eyes and then take a look. Because sometimes we can get so bogged down in the details that we forget how far we've come, and we just need to give it a little bit of time.
Have a bit of perspective. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Last question from... There's a couple more, but we'll ask one and then we'll have another look at another picture, and then we've got one more edit, haven't we? So, and then we'll come back to that. Let's have a look. How do you make the most? Oh, here it is. Okay. In the USA, many of our foods are dyed in vibrant, unnatural colours. Do you find you need to accommodate a variety of regional differences?
Absolutely. That is such a good thing to note, especially coming from Australia to North America. You will notice things like egg yolks are definitely different, and having friends in different parts of the world, you definitely will see, like, rhubarb is something that the colors vary between regions. So I think it depends on, if you're shooting for yourself, you have a little bit more of control over what you want that to look like. But if you have a client in a specific region, that is something you need to remember. Just chat to them. Some clients are like very easy about it all, and others like, this is what it needs to look like, especially, if it's a type of produce that you're working with, or there's something very special about that type of fruit that comes from a region. You would definitely need to focus on those little color differences, which is great that we have the advanced tool to help us get those fine little adjustments. But exactly. Yeah, that is very interesting, because not everybody has experienced things like that. But no. I'm glad that we could talk about that, because that is really important.
Yeah, it's funny, we're getting just broccoli. It's coming from a different country at the moment, and it's a wildly different color to what you're used to. And it still tastes great, but it's still, slightly off-putting when you think, is there something wrong with this or whatever? Yeah. And regionally in different varieties and everything, I'm sure that makes a difference. Okay, shall we? I'll hold those other couple of questions, and then we'll come back to the others after that.
So the last thing I wanted to sort of talk about today was, being a new photographer or a new food photographer. We have all these fabulous tools, and like, there's just so much color when it comes to food that we want to always sort of run towards that saturation and make everything really saturated. But there are occasions where desaturated colors can be just as beautiful. So I think we've got two, if we just look at these full screen. So the one on the left is less saturated, and the one on the right is more saturated. It's slight, and there's no right or wrong here, but sometimes it really helps to think about, like, what is the overall message we're trying to do, or is there a specific color story? Does one particular color really fight for attention in an image, and can we desaturate it? So this particular shot was part of a personal project, and I was focusing on shooting food that was black or white. So you'll know that there's not a ton of those sort of foods out there. And instead of making a black and white food photo, which looks very different, I wanted to sort of explore the textures that we have in foods that don't have a lot of color. So these are pavlova or meringue, which we know is like white. And then I did like a white poached pear, which were quite pale. So simply all I've done for this image is I just headed into the basic panel. You could also do, let's just do saturation as well. So what I probably would have done is had a look at just desaturating this photo overall, because it's not necessarily a color story. This for me was more like focusing on the shapes and the textures within some of those foods, having a little bit of color in there because we always know that food does primarily have some color. So thinking about like, does a photo warrant having colors to be desaturated? So I'm just going to bring that up a little bit more and just desaturate some of the yellows. Like if we go too far, let's just, go really far. So like this looks over edited. There's something that's not quite right about this.
Unless they're very, very pale pears. Yeah.
Yeah. So, just again, a few little bit of those points, a little bit of desaturating a color can work wonders. And, this edit that I did is not life changing, but it's the idea that, if you have colors that are competing or desaturating a color, what does that open up in the photo? Does that allow us to sort of explore the contrast and the texture? So I just wanted to bring that sort of example for you to see and just to think about that in your workflow. If you are going to be desaturating some of these colors, this is too where we might want to think about, could we use the lightness slider to bring that out? So I haven't used that a ton over this tutorial, but it is always something I think about, something I play with. But for something like this, I would also think about, the brightness of this color, and something I would probably bring out a little bit more for this. Jumping back to the idea of like there's never a pure color, we also have probably a little bit of orange that's happening in here as well. Okay, so this is probably where I would just desaturate that a little bit as well, just to bring that color story together essentially.
Perfect. Question from Barb on that. How do you go about desaturating the whites in similar images? Is that something you would do in Capture One or in Photoshop?
So the whites, no, I would do that in Capture One. So like in terms of color correction, I would really want to make sure that my whites are feeling white. So depending on what light you're shooting with, this is artificial light, so I can control it a bit more. If I shot this with natural light where I live, I might have greens coming in from the window, or it might be bouncing across the street from the brick building. So there are going to be some color casts that might come on. So, you can play with some of the colors in the basic editor to like desaturate those if I wanted to remove the blues and the greens to really just focus on those colors. The other thing to think about, and I'm glad you brought that up, is, if we jump into a white screen, how do our colors feel now?
Yeah.
How do our whites feel now? So really simply, if you just right click, you've got the option to change the viewer. So this is a perfect example where you would do that, and then we would reassess those colors because it's primarily a white shot. And then, thinking about, do we need to, you can see that I brought the brightness up from the midtones. I love the brightness slider. It is like my go-to. I rarely will touch exposure, but I do like to change the brightness of the midtones. So thinking about, not only are your whites white, but are they the right tone? Are they bright enough for what you're trying to do as well?
Excellent. Okay, going back to the earlier questions, I think there's 3 or 4, which is perfect timing actually. So in the photo presently on screen, which is not this one, it's an older question. I think it was,
Cheesecake maybe?
I think it was cheesecake or maybe rhubarb. I'm not sure. You'll probably figure it out from the question. There's a gloss, which I think is a vital part of food photography. How do you make the most of it? Which settings do you apply to give the fruit veg that 3-dimensional look? Yeah, I figure it was that one. Yeah.
So I think when it comes to like food, it's one of those things in photography, like I always think of it like a pie. We've all got all these pieces and they all work together. So part of that pie is definitely editing, but it's also lighting. If I had lit this shot differently, you wouldn't have seen that beautiful, like juicy sheen. So part of that is making sure you've lit that correctly.
Yeah.
another part of that is like food styling. So with this, it's stewed rhubarb, so we have some syrup that it stews in and it creates its own juices. This will dry out very quickly under artificial light.
Right.
So every time I take the shot, I do have like a little pastry brush, and I would have, been dipping it in the syrup, or I might have like a separate bowl that I've poured some in, and I would just sort of brush that over so that it is like it's fresh. It looks like it's come straight out of the oven. So that piece then will get picked up by the lighting, and then we enhance it in editing.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, food stylists never have a moment where they're sat doing nothing, really, is there?
No.
It's like the makeup artist for food,
exactly.
Isn't it? They're
yeah.
always fussing. What was the other question? That was, do you find that reds tend to lose detail, turns almost blackish? Is there a recommended maximum saturation point?
Red is an interesting one, and I have been editing photos for a cookbook recently, and I have noticed that using some contrast adjustments can make the reds feel that way. So I think like oranges and reds can also be tricky. So for the reds, I would play with the basic saturation. I would also try advanced, then I'd try the saturation slider, and what I tend to do is I compare them and I try to see what is working the best. Sometimes when it comes, because Capture One, we have a lot of tools, the curve tool that you're using might affect the colors as well. The clarity tool that you're using might affect the colors as well. So what I will tend to do, if I edit a color and I'm like, this is just not working, like, I don't know why, I will go back to the raw file, or I'll do before and after, and I'll see like what is happening on the raw file and what is happening in editing. And then that can sort of help me determine whether it's an edit that I've done that's making it look that way, or if that's actually how it was on the raw file.
And for those watching who might be interested, the contrast slider in Capture One, for the Lightroomers, the contrast slider in Capture One is pretty different to how Lightroom behaves. The contrast slider in Capture One is working not completely, but to some extent almost the majority of luminosity. So it's affecting the brightness of the photo, but it's keeping the color tone relatively static. Because if you use a curve and you put a heavy S curve on an image, the saturation will go up. There's also a luminosity curve in Capture One as well, which will not change the colors whatsoever. But the contrast slider is actually a nice blend of the two. But I guess also for reds, if you're worried that they're going out of range, you could even do a big advanced color editor which covered everything except the reds and play around with saturation. So like I could
just we should reselect.
Oh yeah, and then invert. Yep.
Yeah, so if you press the little here, it's going to select everything but the color you selected. So it's just a really quick way that you could then, if you'd like the reds but everything else needed to be changed, you could quickly just jump in, and you can see it's got the little invert slice tag there.
Yeah, that's a good tip. I'd forgotten about that one. So rather than doing it manually, do what Rachel did and hit the little invert icon.
There's so many options to Capture One. Sometimes it's,
Yep.
just need a little reminder.
There was a question which Diego answered from Susan. She's new to C1, used to Lightroom. So thanks for joining, Susan. And other resources. So, I mean, you're a great resource for food photography, and we'll put your details up on screen before the end. But you have courses and information and webinars and everything, so I'd say
come say hi.
Come say hi. Yeah, exactly. There was a question not related to Capture One, but where's it gone? Wasn't Stephanie. I think it was another Susan. It was on the cheesecake picture. She wanted to know where you got the lovely sugar shaker from in the bottom right hand corner.
Oh, it is that is actually from my mum. But it's a little, like a tea strainer.
Tea strainer,
that
got
I
it.
use. Yeah, so you can find those on Etsy, actually, but quite reasonable. Depending on where you are, shipping might be another challenge.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you look for little tea strainers, that's what I have there, and it's just it's a small size, you know, so you imagine it sits on a teacup. Because one thing with photography, like we don't want to add a huge like colander to the scene. It just would overpower it. So yeah, that's just a little tip.
Tea strainer.
And you can find them on it.
Good idea. Okay, I'll pick 2 more and then we'll make sure we know where to find you. Michael's asking, most foods are brown or beige. What's your trick to make those colours more interesting or poppy? Does that go back to the chocolate cake, I guess?
Yeah, so I mean, I think too, you know, you would play with those colours that we had mentioned. So when it comes to brown, which is why I chose this, because like thinking about, there are reds in there, there are oranges in there, there are yellows in there. But when it comes to like that wow factor, we always want to think about the 3 key things: exposure, contrast, and color. They all work together. The exposure is going to change how a color feels. The contrast is going to change how a color feels. So that's sort of why I do like exposure contrast adjustments first. Then I make my color tweaks. That way you're going to make it pop. You know, you can use your clarity adjustments to further enhance that as well, but make sure that, you know, editing is part of the process. But if we are not lighting a shot to make it pop, it is much harder in editing as well. So just with this photo, I do have like a vignette on there. So that comes back to our exposure, and like the background is darker in this particular shot. So like a vignette like helps us push into the food to like see what's there. And then I think having some sort of garnish, and then we do have like the syrup on that, just adds to the interest there and helps that slice really stand out. Because if this was just a slice of chocolate cake, it is much harder to make it interesting than if there is something else that's happening.
There's a bit of action going on as well, isn't there?
Exactly.
So yeah.
Yeah.
Last couple of people asking monitor recommendations. Are you a tech head or just
calibration is something I'm not strong at, and it is a challenge. But I do have a BenQ monitor.
Yep. Good photo monitor. Yep.
It is really good. The oranges are probably the only thing that I don't necessarily love on it. But oranges, I've been very picky with oranges throughout anything. But I do really like to have that monitor because it's really large, and especially there's lots of tools in Capture One, so that helps me with a larger screen. It gives me more space. I can compare photos really easily. I can change different settings. And another thing just on like calibration I love is that we have like the proofing thing. So if I have to use a different color space, I can really quickly look at what that looks like. So I use the BenQ. I'm not 100% sure on the model, but if you want to like ask me, DM me on Instagram or something, I can find out for you.
And speaking of Instagram, let's just bring that back up. So Two Loves, did I spell that right? Two Love Studio.
Two Love Studio.
Yeah,
yes.
On Instagram. And all your Linktree and contact details is there, isn't it?
Yeah, so you can find me twolovestudio.com. I also teach editing courses, which is courses.twolovestudio.com. Lots of resources on food photography, you know, lighting, editing, composition. I love talking about it all, so you can find all of those there too.
So they've just had a little taste of what you can offer today then.
A little taste, yeah.
To use a terrible food pun, yeah.
No, it's a good one.
Also, you did our Instagram takeover as well, so we're very grateful for you doing that.
Yeah, that was fun.
So hopefully we can have you back again in the future as well.
Yeah.
I'm also going to put a link up, I've just put it in the webinar room, so I've got another guest next week, similar to what you're doing, Rachel, but with product. So that's going to be Zoe Noble, who does product photography, hasn't ventured into food. So she's going to come along next week and do a similar thing with product.
Oh, that'd be good because product and color, like there's certain things you need to think about differently. So
it's exactly.
Look at all the different niches and the things we need to think about.
Yeah, definitely. And as you said, we haven't featured product photographers so much, or food photographers. So it's good to have you guys on as well.
Yeah, it's been amazing. Thank you so much for having me. I know a lot of people would have done your trainings as well, so it's super for me to be able to team up with you and do this. So
Definitely.
thanks again for having me.
Well, I know zero about food, so I need to accept eating it. So it's good to have expertise. So thanks again, Rachel. And this went straight to YouTube. So if anyone's watching and missed the start, you can just head over to YouTube and it will be there on the front page and you can rewind and see it again. So thanks again, Rachel, for joining us and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Bye, everyone.